Oh, thank you guys so much. I am honored to be your pastor and love serving at this church and being a part of all that God is doing here at Freedom. And so I really appreciate that. Y'all are amazing. And so really it should be congregation appreciation, because without you, I would not be a pastor. So thank you so much for your faithfulness and your support and the way that you have dove in and are helping fulfill and continue the mission here at Freedom. So today we're going to be continuing this series in Habakkuk, and I want to ask you this. What do you do when you've prayed and the answer you received was not what you were expecting? Like, what do you do when you've prayed, you've asked God, you've talked to God, and you've prayed and you don't like the answer? Anybody ever been there? I know I have. Perhaps, maybe you've interviewed for that job. And man, you thought you were a lock. You thought it was done. You thought it was a done deal. And you've interviewed and you're like, you prayed about it. You're like, God, I know you're going to give me this job. And they call you and tell you they chose somebody else. Or perhaps you applied to your favorite college. You knew that you had the grades, you had the SAT, you knew you were going to get in, and yet you didn't. Or perhaps you prayed that you would find a husband, but he hasn't found you yet. Or maybe you knew that she was the one, so you got down on one knee, you asked her to marry you. She looks you in the eyes and she goes, "That's nice." Like, we've all been there, haven't we? Where we prayed and we've asked God. Maybe it was that dream job, and man, you took the job. You accepted the job. You started working, and a few months later, things just aren't working out, and you find yourself unemployed again. You know, life can be full of disappointments. Life can be full of these prayers that we thought we prayed for, and the answers aren't what we wanted. Maybe you never dreamed that you would be divorced, and yet that's where you find yourself now. Or perhaps you've been asking over and over and over again for children, and you can't get pregnant. You've asked God for healing, and the treatment isn't working. We've all been there, haven't we? We make our plans. We come up with our ideas. We seek to do God's wills. We even pray to the Lord, but the answer, when it comes, isn't what we expect. What do we do in those moments? I think, unfortunately, this is something we don't talk about often, is it? We don't talk about the difficult times so often in the church. We like to talk about the good times. We like to talk about the times when God answers the prayers exactly the way we want Him to. But that's not the way life works all the time. Because one thing you will discover is that God's plans and your plans often are not exactly the same. You see, sometimes in our lives, God allows things that we don't understand. Sometimes in our world, things happen and we're like, God, where are you? What is going on? Why is this happening? And we know, every single one of you know you're supposed to pray, God, thy will be done. But I don't know about you, but man, it still shocks my system when God has a completely different plan in mind. Anybody with me? Oh yeah. And we've all experienced. And folks, this is the story of Habakkuk. This minor prophet in the Old Testament, this is his story. He had prayed to God. He saw Judah sin. His nation had gone into sin. His nation was not walking with God. He sees that and he prays, God, bring revival, change, do something. Why are you silent? Why aren't you answering my prayer? Because no doubt he'd been praying over and over and over again for God to do something, for God to intervene, for God to bring Judah back into fellowship with Himself. And last week we saw that God answered that prayer. But the prayer and the answer was not what Habakkuk expected. In fact, God says, here's what I'm going to do, Habakkuk. I'm going to do something that would blow your mind if I told you. And He did. Because God said, I am going to use the Babylonians. I am going to use them as an instrument of judgment on my people, Judah. That's not what Habakkuk was expecting. That was definitely not the answer he was wanting. And see, the story of Habakkuk is about this man who can't reconcile his theology. He can't reconcile his view of God with all the injustice, all the suffering, all the corruption that's going on around him. Many of us are in that same place, aren't we? We look upon the world that we've lived in the last several months, and even beyond that. It didn't just start in 2020. It's been going on for ages. In fact, the same things that were happening in our world were happening in Habakkuk's world. Injustice, corruption, suffering. And we look at it and we go, God, I don't understand. In fact, there was a recent survey that was made, and the question was this, just one question. It said, if you could ask God anything, and you knew that He would answer, what would you ask Him? And by far, the number one question that people would ask God was, why is there suffering and pain in the world? Why do you allow suffering and pain to occur? And that is exactly what Habakkuk is wrestling with. He's looking at his world and he's saying, God, how can you send the Babylonians to judge Judah? And when God answered him that way, it just created more questions. You ever been in that moment where God answers your prayer and now you go, okay, wait a second, God, I got more questions now. I got more issues now. Like I was confused, now I'm really, really confused. And that's the Habakkuk's thing. Because, seriously, how can a holy God use an unholy people to bring judgment upon His own people? But that's the exact answer that Habakkuk received from God. That's exactly what he's going to do. And so when he hears this, he's objecting. He's like, God, no, there's no way this can happen. Habakkuk is a frustrated man of faith who can't understand God's ways. Have you ever been there? I know I have. In fact, I was texting with a friend over this weekend, and he was just talking about all these things that had happened to him over the last several years, and just pain after pain, suffering after suffering. He's going, why? Why does God allow this to continue? I know many of you in this room and many of you watching online could be asking the same thing. God, why? Why are you allowing this to happen? And in the last half of Habakkuk 1, the first chapter in this book, the prophet Habakkuk shows us what to do when we don't understand God's ways. He shows us exactly how you and I can navigate life even when we don't understand how God is working. Even when we don't understand what God is up to. Even when it's confusing and it's mind-blowing. And He shows us what we can do. And the way He does that is by, instead of fooling around with what He doesn't know, Habakkuk starts verse 12 with what he does know. Now think about this. If you have a mathematics problem, I want you to think about it this way. If you have a math problem and you have 5 unknowns, can you solve the problem? That's all you have is 5 unknowns. Can you solve that problem? No, it's impossible. You cannot solve a math problem with all unknowns. But if you have 4 knowns and 1 unknown, can you solve the math problem? Yes. So what Habakkuk, this is brilliant what Habakkuk does. He goes, instead of focusing on what I don't know, I'm going to focus on what I do know. Because the reality is many of us are focusing on what we don't know. We're focusing on the uncertainty. We're focusing on the questions as opposed to what we do know. And if all we're doing is focusing on the questions, if all we're doing is focusing on the unknown, what it's going to do is going to stalemate us. It's going to cause us to stop moving forward. It's going to cause us to go in this deep, dark hole. I know I've been there before when I'm just focusing on what I don't know, what I don't understand, and that consumes me. Instead, what Habakkuk says is, no, we'll get to what you don't know. But first, let's focus on what I do know. And so when faced with the news that the hated Babylonians were going to invade Judah, and there was nothing that anyone could do about it, Habakkuk takes a step back and focuses on what he does know. And he says this, basically. He says, here's what I do know about God. And based on what I do know about God, that's what I'm going to focus on. So hopefully I can understand what I do not know about how God's working right now. So he takes a step back, and let's listen to what he says in verse 12 of Habakkuk 1. He says this. This is Habakkuk speaking. He says, he's talking to God, are you not from everlasting? O Lord, my God, my Holy One, we shall not die. O Lord, you have ordained them as a judgment, and you, O rock, have established them for reproof. Now let's stop right there. What Habakkuk is doing is saying, listen, even in the midst of this, even in the midst of this uncertainty, even in the midst of all the things I do not know, here's what I do know about God. In verse 12, he lays out all these things he believes and knows about God. I want you just to listen to the things that he says he knows about God. First of all, he says, I know that God is everlasting. In other words, God, you are eternal. You are sovereign. You are beyond time and space. Like, I'm limited to what I see right now, but God, you are eternal. You see the big picture. You see it all at one point. You see everything in your plan at one point. I'm just seeing this little sliver of time and space, and I don't understand it, but God, you see the bigger picture. God, you are eternal. You are in control. You were here before all this started, and you will be here after it all ends. And so that's exactly what Habakkuk is saying. God, you created history, and you control history. And I don't know about you, but that makes me a little bit at ease, right? Like when I don't understand, when I have questions, when I have doubts, knowing that my God is bigger than all of those things, knowing that my God is beyond time and space, knowing that He is eternal and sees the big picture, man, that just brings a sense of ease, even though I don't have my questions answered just yet. So the first thing he says is, one thing I know is that God, you are eternal. Next thing he says, God, you are self-existent. Look what he says. He says, O Lord, my God. That word Lord that he uses there is Yahweh, which is the same word that God gave to Moses when Moses asked him, God, if I go back to Egypt to set your people free, who should I tell them sent me? And he says, tell them I am sent me. In other words, I am. My existence is not conditioned upon what's going on around you. I am self-existent. The things going on in your world do not impact who I am at all. Because I am the great I am. So Habakkuk says, God, you are self-existent. Nothing in our world impacts who you are. Nothing in our world changes your existence. Your dependence is not based on anything except your existence. It's not dependent upon anything. But he also goes on, he says, you are my God. This is huge, folks. He says, you are my God. He says it twice, in fact. In other words, God, you are personal. You're not distant, far off, God. You're not looking down at a distance. No, you are personal. I can know you. You love me. You will not forsake me. Habakkuk is going, God, you are personal. You're not removed from me. And I think oftentimes when we face difficulties, when we face the unknown, we think that God's left us, that God's forgotten us, that God's moved away from us. And Habakkuk reminds us, no. You are my God. You are personal. You're not just the God of Israel, though he was. You're not just the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, though he was. But what does he say? You are my God. But he doesn't stop. He goes, God, you are my Holy One. God, you are holy. You are set apart. You are righteous. God is absolutely, perfectly righteous and holy. These are things that Habakkuk is saying. This is what I do know. There's a lot I don't know, but I do know these things. I know that God is holy. I know that He is in a class by Himself. I know that He is set apart from sin. I know that He can do no wrong because He is righteous and because He is holy. But He doesn't stop. He goes on to say, we shall not die. Now that seems odd, doesn't it? It seems odd that he would say we shall not die, because if you know anything about the Babylonians, every time they invaded a nation, people died. Anytime and every time they invaded a nation, they were cruel, they were nasty, and people would lose their lives. But Habakkuk says, we will not die. See, in other words, he's going, God, you are faithful. Here's what Habakkuk knew. He knew that God is a God of promises. And way back to Abraham, God made an unconditional promise to His people. And that promise was this, that you will be as numerous as the sand on the shore and the stars in the sky. And Habakkuk knew that God had made that promise, and that promise was unconditional, regardless of whether the nation walked away from God. God was going to keep that promise. Now, yes, people would die. Yes, people would suffer. Yes, they would be taken into captivity, but God would always be faithful and raise up a remnant. God would always be faithful to keep that promise and raise up a remnant to carry on with His people. And so Habakkuk is acknowledging that, God, you're faithful. Even though this is going to be hard, even though I don't understand why you're doing this, God, you are faithful. But he doesn't stop there. He goes on to say, God, you are my stronghold. Look what he says. He says, God, you're my rock. You're my firm foundation. You are the rock on which I stand. You are all powerful. There's nothing that you can't do, because you are my rock, and nothing happens outside of your sovereign will. Nothing happens outside of your plan. Nothing happens outside of you, and you are my refuge, and you are my rock, and you are my help in times of trouble. So what Habakkuk is doing, he's saying, listen, God, these are all the things that I know about you. And church, I want you to know this is incredibly important that we grasp this. Because here's the truth. If we don't understand the God that we serve, here's what will happen. If we remove God's sovereignty, we begin to question His wisdom. If we remove God's love, we begin to question His faithfulness. If we remove God's majesty, we begin to question His power. If we remove God's holiness, we begin to question His fairness. If we remove God's protection, we begin to question His goodness. And so Habakkuk says, first of all, step back and remember what you do know about God. That's the first step when we face uncertainty. That's the first step when we don't know what's going on and don't understand how God's moving and don't understand why He answered our prayers the way that He did. The first thing we got to do is we got to step back and remember. We have to remember what we do know about God. And here's the key question that many of us in this room and online are going to have to answer. Is not, do you believe in God? Because I think everybody in this room and everybody watching online will say, yeah, I believe in God. The question is not, do you believe in God? But the question is, what kind of God do you believe in? Do you believe in the God that only answers your prayers the way you want Him to? Do you believe in a God that only does what you want Him to? That's a God in your own mind. That's a God of your own making. But Habakkuk is saying, no, I believe in a God that is eternal. I believe in a God that was here before all this mess started and will be here when it's all over. I believe in a God who's self-existent. There is no problem too big for Him because He stands beyond time and space. I believe in a God that is almighty. Nothing happens that He does not allow to happen. But that also means that He also works all things for the good of those who are called according to His purposes. You see, not all things that happen to us are good. Just look at the book of Job. God allowed tragedy to come upon Job's life. But yet, He turned that and took that and turned it into good. And Paul promises us that, yes, not all things are good. You see, the fact that you and I live in a fallen, sinful world, there is going to be pain, there's going to be suffering, and that's of our own doing. We're the ones that chose to walk away from God from the very beginning. We're the ones that were born with a sinful nature that was rebellious against God, that deserved His wrath, that deserved His punishment. Yet in His grace, He sends His Son Jesus to redeem us. But yet, that sin is still left in this world. But Habakkuk says, no, I believe in a God that is almighty. I believe in a God that can work all things, even bad things, even difficult things, even confusing things for His good. But he not only says, he says this, I believe in a God that is holy. He'll never do anything wrong. I believe in a God that is faithful. He will always keep His promises. I believe in a God who is a stronghold, that I am always secure in Him. See, what I've discovered is that when I face confusing times, when I face challenges, when I face the unknown, when I face things that are uncertain, the moment I begin to think about how big God is the moment all my problems seem to get smaller and smaller. But the reality is that doesn't mean they go away, does it? Like, we want them to go away. Anybody else want them to go away? I know I do. I want them just to go away, but that's not the way it always works. Sometimes those problems are still there, and that's exactly what happened with Habakkuk. Look at verse 13. He says, you who are purer eyes than to see evil. In other words, God, you can't even look upon evil. Why do you sit idly by and look at traitors and remain silent when the wicked swallow up the man more righteous than he? What's Habakkuk saying? He's saying, God, you are holy and you are just. You can't even look upon sin, yet you're going to use this nation of Babylon, who is far more sinful than Judah, and you're going to use them to judge us? And he still doesn't understand. Even though he's set his focus on what he does know about God, it doesn't take his questions away. He still has questions. He's still living in uncertainty. How can God, a God who cannot tolerate sin, how can He use the Babylonians? Because the Babylonian sin was far greater than Judah's sin. But here's the reality. Habakkuk's forgotten something. And that is this, that God uses sinful people all the time. All the time. The fact that God would use me and the fact that God would use you proves that He uses sinful people all the time. He uses unrighteous people all the time, because the reality is every single one of us are sinners. You are all sinners. I am a sinner. You are all unrighteous. I am unrighteous. See, the only way we have any righteousness whatsoever is because it's not our righteousness, but it's Christ's righteousness. Because your righteousness and my righteousness is like filthy rags before a holy God. So God always uses sinful instruments, sinful people to accomplish His purposes. In fact, Paul said to the church in Rome, he said, none is righteous, no, not one. No one understands. No one seeks God. All have turned aside. Together they've all gone wrong. No one does good, not even one. Just look at your neighbor and say, you don't do any good. Because it's true. Our own righteousness is worthless. Yet God in His mercy gives us Christ's righteousness. But Habakkuk failed to understand that. And he's questioning. And then in verses 14 through 16, he uses this metaphor to show the power and the might of the Babylonian army. And we're not going to read those verses, but here's basically what he says. He says, Babylon is like the fisherman, and all the nations are like the fish. And he says, Babylon cast its net, and the net falls into the ocean, and it scoops up all the nations in his net and takes them captive. And then that leads to Habakkuk's final question. And this is what he says in verse 17. Is he, that is Babylon, to keep on emptying his net and mercilessly killing nations forever? You see, Habakkuk's going, listen, God, okay, I get it. They're going to overtake us. They're going to take us into captivity. But how long is this going to happen? How long are you going to continue to let Babylon take over nation after nation after nation? Which that's the age-old question, isn't it? Whenever our lives begin to fall apart, whenever things begin to unravel, whenever we face challenges and difficulties and confusion and uncertainty, what is the number one question we always ask? How long is this going to happen? How many more things do I have to endure? You ever ask that? That's what Habakkuk's asking. God, how long is this going to happen? Because here's the reality. I think a majority of us, if not all of us, if we knew the time frame of the challenges that we would face, and we knew this is going to last for 6 months. Most of us say, okay, I can endure that. See, that when we have the hope of an end date to our difficulties, to our challenges, to our suffering, if we have an end date to that, we have hope. We're like, okay, great. I can press through over the next few months or maybe even year. But listen, if we don't have any hope of an end date, it is very hard to keep going. It is very hard to keep faithful. And yet, that's why Habakkuk says, how long will this last? God, I can endure for a season, but I need to know that this will end. I need to know that this is going to stop. See, Habakkuk has confidence in God. He's already established that. This is who I believe God to be. His confidence is in God, but he's confused by what God's doing in the world. You ever been there? I know I have. I know I am. And what I love about Habakkuk is he doesn't just jump in to hiding his doubts with Christian cliches. Like we hide our doubts that way, don't we? I know I do. I hide my doubts by just throwing out Christian cliches. Well, God said it. I believe it. That settles it. Okay. Has it really settled it for you? Or do you still have questions? Do you still have doubts? Do you still have confusion? Then stop saying that. Yes, God said it, and I'm going to believe it. But I'm still wrestling with it. God would rather you have an honest conversation with Him about your questions and your doubts than to throw out Christian cliches. What about this one? Maybe some of you have thrown out this one. The Lord won't give me more than I can handle. It's hogwash. It's not true. God will 100% give you more than you can handle. Write it down. It's coming. He will do it. Why does He do it? Because He wants you to depend upon Him. He wants to drive you to dependence. That's why He gives us more than we can handle. We're never intended to handle it by ourselves. We're intended to handle it with Him. We're intended to handle it in community with others. How about this one? When God closes the door, He opens a window. Stop saying that. Because here's the truth. Sometimes God closes the door and He locks the window. Still true. To stop saying that. It doesn't. That's not what it means. God closes doors, He closes windows because we're at the wrong address. Some of us say this, well, you know what? I'm never more safe than when I'm in God's will. No! God's will can be one of the most dangerous places you can live. It was God's will that Jesus went to the cross to die for our sin. It was God's will that Paul spent the majority of his Christian life in prison. It was God's will that the apostles all died martyrs. God's will can be extremely difficult, but we don't talk about that much in the church, do we? God's will can be challenging, but here's the reality. We have to go back to what we know about God. We know that He's faithful. We know that He's eternal. We know that He's holy. We know that He's self-existent. We know that He's personal. And He will never forsake us. See, that's why it's so important to follow what Habakkuk said and go back to what God has told us. Now in chapter 2, God's going to answer Habakkuk. But you got to wait until we get there. We'll talk about that in a couple of weeks. But here's what I want you to do. Here's what I want you to think about. What do you do? What do you do in your life between your questions and God's answers? Have you ever thought about that? What do you do in your life? What are we supposed to do between our questions and God's answers? Well, that leads us to the second principle when we face confusion, when we face uncertainty, when we don't understand what God is doing. The first one is we have to step back and remember what we do know about God. The second one is very simply this: we have to wait. Listen to what Habakkuk said in chapter 2, verse 1. Just before God answers him, he says this: I will take my stand at the watchpost and station myself on the tower, and I will look out to see what He, God, will say to me and what I will answer concerning my complaint. What is he saying? He says, I am going to go and I'm going to stand on the watchtower and I'm going to look out and wait on God to answer. Don't you love that? No, you don't, and I don't either. None of us like to wait. None of us. If you say you like to wait, you're lying. You're lying to yourself, you're lying to us, you're lying to God. None of us like to wait. And yet that is exactly what Habakkuk says he's going to do. He says, I'm going to station myself on the watchtower, and I'm going to look out, and I'm going to wait for God to answer. So we don't like to wait, but that's how we navigate through uncertainty. We stand on what we know about the Lord, and we wait on Him to answer. James Baxter, who was an Australian pastor, he once said, people say that God does not speak to men as He did long ago. But then he said, but the truer statement is that men do not listen today as they did long ago. See, our problem is not that we don't get answers from God. Our problem is we want the answers now. Our problem is that we're not willing to wait on God's answers. We want them right now. And whenever there's delay, we start taking things and matters into our own hands. Listen, we don't know how long Habakkuk waited. He didn't know how long he was going to have to wait. But what he did know is that he had said everything on his heart and mind, and he'd laid it out before God. And then he says, now, God, all I know to do is to wait on you to answer. Remember, he still at this point doesn't understand. He doesn't understand how God could use the wicked Babylonians. Habakkuk doesn't understand how God tolerates sin, injustice, and suffering. He doesn't understand how long Judah will be held captive and will be judged. And we're not going to see that answer until we get down to verse 2 in chapter 2. But for now, we're going to have to wait. Just like Habakkuk, we're going to have to wait because we're going to be talking about this in a couple of weeks. We're going to be talking about how God answered Habakkuk and what he said. And as he's waiting, here's what I want us to do. I want us to look at one verse, the end of one verse in verse 4 of chapter 2. And he says this. This is God speaking to Habakkuk. We'll look at the whole answer in a couple of weeks, but here's what he says. But the righteous shall live by faith. Listen, church, faith comes before understanding. Habakkuk was confident in God because he remembered who God was and who God is. And he's willing to wait upon the Lord to answer because he knows that God is faithful. He knows that God will come through. And he knows that faith comes before understanding, not the other way around. We must trust God even in the midst of uncertainty, even in the midst of not understanding, even in the midst of confusion times. In fact, Proverbs 3 says this, trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not lean on your own understanding, but in all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will make your paths straight. There are really only two choices we have. When we face doubts, when we face questions, when we face confusion, when we don't understand how God's working, we have two choices. One, we can trust in Him. We can remember who He is. We can place our trust in Him, and then we can hope and we can wait in confidence and in faith, knowing that He will answer. Or we can trust in ourselves. Those are our two options. There's really no middle ground. You're either trusting in God or you're trusting in yourself. And when we trust in self, we begin to live by our own rules. We begin to take matters into our own hands. And I don't know about you, but I've tried that route on multiple occasions where I've tried to trust in myself, and it never turns out well. So my encouragement as we wait to hear God's answer to Habakkuk is that you would choose faith, choose trust, choose to wait on God to answer whatever you're wrestling with. And as you wait, I want you to remember that God hasn't forsaken you. I want you to remember that He sees you in your confusion. He sees you in your fear. He sees you in your despair. And I want you to rest on the promise that He delivered to Isaiah where He said, "But they who wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles, and they shall run and not be weary, and they shall walk and shall not faint." Let's pray. Father, I know that many people in here and watching online are in that place between their questions and your answer. And they're struggling to wait. They're struggling to sit at the watchtower and wait on you to answer. And Father, I pray that you would renew their strength. That you would give them the ability to run and not grow faint and weary, and to walk and not faint. Father, I pray that you give them the ability to wait on you, even though they don't know how you're going to answer. And Father, the way we are able to wait is by first and foremost remembering who you are. God, you are eternal. You are righteous. You are self-existent. You are holy. You are our personal God. You are our stronghold in times of trouble. Father, help us to remember who you are and to wait for you to answer. Because ultimately, God, it comes down to two choices. We either trust you or we trust ourselves. And I know for me, God, I do not want to trust myself. I don't want to lean on my own understanding. Because my own understanding will constantly lead me astray. But Father, I want to rest in you. I want to rest in your understanding, in your wisdom, in who you are. And then I want to wait on you to answer. Help us to do that. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Now, church, we're going to close in a time of worship. And I know some of you are here this morning and you're in that waiting period. And you've been praying, you've been asking God. Maybe He's answered and you don't like the answer. Maybe He hasn't answered yet. Listen, I just want to give you an opportunity during this time of worship to just come up before this altar, come up, even make your seat an altar. Just kneel down and just beg out to God, cry out to God, just like Habakkuk did. In your despair, in your confusion, in the uncertainty, just seek His face. He may ask you to wait. He may ask you to, I'm not answering right now, but sometimes He may deliver that answer. But my encouragement to you is to go, not to hide behind cliches, but to truly have an honest, raw conversation with God. Because as we talked about last week, it is in our doubt, it is in our confusion that God strengthens our faith. But we have to allow Him to do that. We have to wrestle with this stuff. And so my encouragement to you is to do just that. Also, as an act of worship, I encourage you to support the ministry through your tithes, your offerings. You can do so through the offering boxes in the back, either during this worship set as an act of worship or on your way out, or you can do it if you're watching online. You can do it by visiting our website and go into our giving page. But just encourage you to keep in mind that all those are an act of worship. And let's trust Him and not trust in ourselves. Let's stand, let's worship Him.